Hey guys, today I'm back in Polybridge and I want to try using glitches to make an engine that can power a train. Now I've been asked to make a train quite a bit and I think that this makes it a good challenge. So let's get right into it. So I'm starting out here in the sandbox and you can see the first thing I'm doing is playing around the islands quite a bit. I ended up just leaving them alone for the most part though, and I'm starting on the engine now. So I figured the engine's probably a good thing to start with, since if I can't make that, the rest of the train's sort of not going to be able to be made, so might as well just get this working. And the first thing I do is you can see I have a stretched spring on a bunch of steel. Now I actually have to turn on unbreakable mode so that it doesn't all fall apart on me, and I actually still kind of does. So to put in an extra steel piece just to hold it all together. And you can see now, this in theory should work. So I've seen before that springs and rotation is just a bad combination and it causes a lot of weird free energy stuff. And here I was going to see if I could just make a very simple one. And you can see when it returns to that red line that I marked before, it's actually slightly below it. So it's losing a bit of height, it's not actually gaining any speed. And I wanted to start out with a completely fresh design. But when I try running this, it just expands out and does some weird stuff. So I used a few more steel pieces, a few more springs. I was hoping to reinforce it a bit, but it's still compressed oddly on itself. So I'd use a few steel pieces to keep it rigid, and giving it a test here, you can actually see it starts rotating. And more than that, it continues to do that, and it accelerates so much that it's at a pretty good clip now. So already, this was looking pretty good, and hopefully reversed its direction. I used a wood piece dangling off the side, and this actually seemed to work, and it started rotating the other direction now. So these engines don't seem to care about which direction they go, but they do seem to add speed to whichever direction they are currently going in. So now what I'm doing is hooking up 4 of these engines together, and I'm using some 4-bar linkages to do that. Now 4-bar linkages lock the rotation of 2 bodies, or in this case I can use a bunch of them to lock 4 bodies, all in unison, and when I do that, I should get 4 times the power out of these engines. And here I actually kind of failed to do it. You can see it all just kind of fell apart because I forgot to pin all the centers of rotation of the other 3 engines in place. So as I did that there, you can see it starts rotating, and it actually seems to be pretty good. But after adding the other arms that I forgot to put in from before, it kind of seemed to be worse. So it struggled to start up, and once it did, it was going at a much slower speed. So that engine was working pretty well, and I was happy with it, but I thought I could do a little bit better, and for that, I just want to go for an even simpler design. You can see here I have a bunch of steel pieces in a plus shape, and I'm putting a bunch of stretched springs on the outside of those. And once I have that in place, you can see here it starts rotating much better than the other engines do, and it gets up to a little bit of a higher speed, not something crazy though. So I figure maybe I can improve this once again by putting 4 of these together. So once I get them in place, you can see here I'm just using 4-bar linkages once again to hold them all together and to keep the rotation going at the same rate. But I do the same thing I did before, and I forgot to pin them in place. So after doing that, you can see here I give it a test, and it's not really working. So it's struggling to start. It goes back and forth quite a bit, and eventually here you can see it deforms. So it seems like attaching these 4-bar linkages directly to the springs is a bad idea, because the way the springs stretch and contract sort of pulls them out of shape and puts a lot of stress in the system and stops it from rotating. So I put some arms on the end of this mechanism, and I was going to use these to attach the 4-bar linkages to, but it actually gave me another idea. You can see it's going at about the same speed, and I figured I could use a bit more springs to get a bit of a better speed before I start doing anything else. So I put in 4 compressed springs directly to the rotational point, and I make sure to put in that star shape once again, and giving it another test. It seems to be going a lot faster than the other engine did, and it seemed to start up a little bit better as well. So with that done, I just copied it over 3 more times, made sure to pin them all in place, and then use 4-bar linkages to lock all the rotation together. And now giving it a test, you can see when it spins up, it's actually not too bad at all. But I figured I could do a little bit better than that, and this is the final engine design I ended up coming up with. But starting it out here, there's a bit of a problem. The way the springs expand since they're compressed is a little bit weird, and it deforms the whole shape. So to keep it all together, what I do is add in a second one of these rotated 90 degrees, and then use cables to hold all the corners together. And now giving it a test, nothing really happens. And this seemed weird because it really should have been working since the last design I basically had the same thing, except that I didn't have the stretched springs. So I changed these springs over to stretched springs and made sure to brace it all together. And once I did this, you can see it starts off pretty slow, but it does start to go. And this told me that the compressed springs probably don't add to this rotation, and it's just the stretched springs. So it's an interesting discovery because that means that I can pretty much just go crazy with the stretched springs, and that's what I do here. So I'm putting a bunch of them against the rotational point, and I just want to see how much speed I get out of this. Now when I was putting in some steel to try to brace this all together, I ran into a problem I usually don't run into, which is I have too many nodes hooked up to that center joint. You can have a max of 32, and I guess I've reached it now. So thankfully all the nodes I already have connected is everything I need, so for now it's not a problem. It's gonna be a problem in a little bit and I'll have to delete springs, but I'll worry about that later. I have a square structure in place, and it should be everything I need to start holding the springs. So to do that, I'm using a bunch of steel pieces to pin them against the sides. I'm putting in only a limited number for now just to see how it rotates, and you can see it's not bad. This is with only about about, I don't know, maybe 6 springs on each side actually pulling against this, and not even fully pulling against it. So the fact it's working right now means it actually probably has a pretty good chance. So I put in 2 more sets of springs, holding all of these fully taut, and giving you another test now, you can see it's not bad at all. It actually seems to rotate much faster than the other engine did, and it gets up to a much higher speed. So already this isn't bad, and there's still some optimization to do, and it's what I'm doing now. So I just have a few more steel pieces to put in on the corners. And once I got those in place, you can see here, it starts up much faster than the other engine, faster than it did before as well. And the speed it gets up to is crazy. It's so much faster than the other engine. It actually rotates about 50% faster than the other engine, and I don't really know if I could do better than this, because to be quite honest, I've literally never seen something rotate this fast in the game. It's a rare situation where I actually have something that's much better than I expected it to be. Now I also connected up 4 of these together, and it works, but it's not really an improvement on anything, and if I go at 300% speed, it starts lagging my game, so I just decided I didn't want to deal with that at all, and instead I'm just going to work with one of these engines to power my train. Now as an interesting quick side thing, this is actually working so well, I wanted to see if I could do something that I have never done before, which is make a boat. Now this is very difficult because every time I try to do this, everything just sinks, and it's really hard to get enough speed and force to push myself up through the water. And now giving it a test, you can see it falls in the water, and it starts to push itself forward a bit, but it's undeniably sinking, and it's not even close to working. So if I want to make a boat, I'm going to need mods or something. I'll need to worry about that later. For now though, I want to get this train working, and I start building up a bit of a flat piece of land to start putting the train on. And I just want to set the engine on the ground and see what would happen, and you can see it's not rotating at all, but there is something interesting happening. It's sliding slightly, and the ground's not sloped or anything. I think it's just trying to rotate, and that's what's causing it to kind of shimmy over to the side. So interesting, but not very useful. And to make it useful, what I want to do is, you see I copied over the center square from the engine, and I'm going to use a 4-bar linkage to connect it up to the engine, and I'm going to use this as the center of my wheel. So after getting some framing pieces put in place and also making sure to put a little bit of base in place to hold it off the ground, you see here I started up, and the rotation from the engine is being carried over, so I should be able to use this to power up a wheel. So speaking of which, next thing to do is, well, make that wheel. And right now I have a square, so to fix that, I'm just putting in a few more spokes. And once I have those spokes in place, I just connect them all together using some road pieces. And after I have that, I just copy it back over onto the wheel. But I have a bit of a problem because 2 of them don't copy right. I could fix that in a second though. I just wanted to see what would happen right now. And it has a bit of trouble starting because of this. It seems like missing those 2 road pieces throws off the weight a lot. And here it actually really messes it up. You can see it's jumping way off the ground and eventually just falls on the ground. Now a good sign here is that the engine hit the ground twice and was still rotating in the same direction. So this means it should still have a lot of force. Now, maybe there's just some wishful thinking here. So what I did is copied over a second wheel, and I wanted to give it an honest test to see how it would perform as a car. So building up that wheel, I had a little bit of trouble getting it put in place, so I used some pieces of steel to make sure to mark its location. But once I got that there, I connected up to the engine, and you'll actually notice I had to delete 2 springs to make this work. And actually I had to delete 2 springs earlier as well, so I deleted 4 springs in the engine to make this work. And that's a lot of springs to be deleting. So the force of the engine I figured was probably severely diminished at this point, and I was worried it wasn't going to work nearly as well. Now in this first test here, you can see I actually kind of forgot to make it correctly, and it just sort of fell apart. So I have to make sure that wheel can't rotate around the pivot point of the engine. And to do this, I need to add in 1 steel muscle to hold it all rigid. But when I give it a test here, you can see it doesn't really work. The engine starts to rotate, but then immediately stops. And I think the problem is that the engine produces the majority of its power when it's going really fast. It produces almost none when it's going slowly. So to hopefully fix this problem, I'm holding it up off the ground using a split joint, and the engine can get up to speed, and then this can start moving, and you can see now it works. Well, at least until it hits the land and then ends up stopping. But until then it worked. Now to optimize this, I'm replacing the road pieces on the wheels with steel pieces since it actually makes no difference to how it moves, but it is lighter. And giving another test on the other side here, you see I get it up to a much higher speed before I start going, and now it hits the ground and you can see it really starts moving. So I was a little bit worried that the only reason it was moving before was just the inertia of the engine was sort of keeping it going, but actually here it's accelerating as it's going. So I was taking this to mean that the engine was actually actively producing power rather than just being some flywheel that it's pulling energy from. So to improve the looks of the engine a bit too, I just pulled in the corners, and it performs exactly the same. It just looks a little bit more circular and nice in my opinion. And I actually ran this up a bunch of steps, and you see that worked just fine. It slowed down a little bit, but I feel like that's to be expected, and once I got over the other side, it was still moving. So really this seems to have a good amount of power, and the next thing I wanted to do was expand out the island a little bit more to give myself a bit more room to run, and start working on the body of this. So I moved up the engine and pulled it out of the way, and I also added in 4 wheels. Well, I guess 3 more wheels. And the reason I did this is to give it a little bit more of a train look. I'm not very artistic, so I was trying my best here, but I think I got something that looked pretty good in the end. So I started out with the cow catcher, and once that was done, it was sort of me just looking at reference images and hoping it was going to look okay. And here you can see I got this shape, which isn't that bad, and just had to make sure to brace it together so it doesn't fall apart. And the top fell apart, don't worry about that, but the bottom actually looked good and was holding the wheels together. And now I have to focus on the top, and for that, basically just a bunch of steel pieces put in place, and I have this big mesh, and you can see it all holds together, and everything works well. So now I gotta add in the engine, and this just copy paste it in place basically, and I add in 2. And I wanted a little bit more power originally, so I added in the 2, but this actually wasn't necessary at all, and I needed the space in the back for another mechanism I'll show later. So for now, you see the engine spinning up, and still works fine, and I got that space in the back to use for later. Now when I hook up the engine to the back wheel, you can see same problem from before. It just doesn't have the power to move it while it's not spun up at all. So I moved the entire train over to the left side, and deleted the 4-bar linkage, and here I have a simple demo going. I just want to find out a mechanism to be able to couple the engine to the wheel after a certain amount of time, so it's able to spin up first. And here, I just have a 4-bar linkages and 2 squares moving, and you see here, exactly the same way I've had it before, but I wanted to change it up a little bit. So instead of using ropes, what I'm doing is using some steel pieces. And this functions fundamentally the same way. You can see as the one rotates, the other rotates as well, and all is good. But if I replace the steel pieces with hydraulics, while they're not expanding or contracting, I should get the same effect, and you can see that does happen here. But if I set these hydraulics to expand out, now you can see something interesting happens. Once they expand out, the rotation is no longer being carried over, and in fact they're rotating completely independently of each other. And I was hoping to use this system to put the engine basically in neutral, have it rotate on its own, and then only later couple them, so it'll be able to be spun up before it has to spin up the wheel. So that demo looking good, I deleted all that stuff, and what I wanted to do was basically just rebuild it for these wheels. So here I have the same idea, except I have 4 hydraulics instead of 2 hydraulics for each chain, and it actually initially seemed to be working really well. Once they expand, you can see the engine's moving, but it kind of stopped and then moved in the other direction, and it stops a lot. And I think the problem here is that the hydraulics, while they're fully expanded out, they kind of can mechanically lock into each other since there's only 4 segments, which makes them really tug on the engine and then just completely stop it. So to fix that problem, I put in more hydraulics, so you see now I have about 6 on each chain. You see the engine's actually getting up to a decent speed, but when the hydraulics expand, they really tug on the engine and the wheel at the same time, and that shock immediately causes the engine to just stop. So unfortunately, this design just isn't quite gonna work, but I thought I had something similar that might do the trick. So for that, I have my 4-bar linkages back in place here in the 2 rotating squares, but what I wanted to do is instead of expanding out the rods connecting the 2 squares together, I just wanted to physically push them closer together. So the effect this has is basically the same. I'm in effect expanding out those rods, but this gives me a bit more of a controlled way of doing it since I just have 1 hydraulic instead of a large chain of them, actually 4 large chains of them. And you see here, once they expand it out, these 2 squares are mostly not coupled together, and then once they pull back in place, they're basically in sync. Now I can improve this by shrinking down the squares a lot, and what this allows me to do is push in the squares a smaller distance, and in this case I needed it to be a smaller distance, for them to be completely decoupled from each other. So with that done, it actually kind of looks pretty promising, and what I wanted to do was just get a rotating square in place and make this work. Now I couldn't start out with those small squares like I wanted to, because the engine has a large square on it, and I can't really make a smaller one since I can't connect to the center node, so I have to go through this intermediary square, and that's basically just what I'm doing here. And I have a small square in the center, and I'm just bracing it all together. Once I have that, I'm putting in another smaller square, and this is the one I'm going to have the hydraulic on. So use a 4-bar linkage to connect up the first square to the second square here, and you can see how they rotate together. And now I'm using a hydraulic, and I should be able to push this out, and you can see here, the rotation from the one square isn't being carried over to the other one. It kind of freaks out sometimes, and it's because I'm actually not pushing it in far enough, but it's good enough for now. I can get some good tests in place. So I connect this up to the wheel, and you can see here, the engine starts rotating, and it's completely decoupled, and only once I pull it in, the wheel starts rotating as well, and it doesn't completely stop the engine from moving, and in fact, the whole train starts to push itself backwards. It ends up stopping because it ends up having to go up on a little bit of an incline, but that was a pretty good start, and hopefully get it to move in the other direction. You can see I'm using a rope from the center of the engine connect to the outside. Now, this just has the effect of pulling it in a little bit where the rope is, and for whatever reason, this causes it to rotate in the other direction. Now, this is the most effective way I ever found to reverse the direction of the engine rotation, and in fact, it's going to be the basis of how I'm going to make the engine go in the opposite direction once I have it do a return trip. But for now, you can see, it ends up working out fine, and this actually gets a train all the way over to the other side, and it's looking pretty good. So now with the train working, I need some cars to put behind it, so that's what I'm working on now. So the first thing I do is just copy over a wheel. I put one up in the front and have to connect it up to the train, and I also put one in the back as well. Now, the spacing of these wheels, I was kind of guessing, and I ended up putting them at a convenient distance apart. And once I did that, I just made sure to brace them together so that they're rigid. And I went for a weird structure here. I'm not sure what I was kind of going for, but I ended up just going for this basic steel structure to make it look somewhat good. And once I was done there, I gave it a quick test now, and the engine actually started up fine. fine, but it had a problem when I tried to engage it. It worked just like it was supposed to, but it ends up not quite having enough power to pull the train as well. And I think the problem was that my wheels were too angular and I need to make them a little more round. So I'm adding more spokes to make them a little bit more smooth, and you can see I got that in place here. And once that's done, next thing I need to do is just replace all the wheels with this new wheel design, and easy enough to do. I just have to copy paste it on top of it once I delete the old one. So I do that for all of them, and giving it a test now, you can see it starts up the train and it starts moving. Now there's also a hidden gem here, because you can see once the engine actually ends up engaging with the wheel ends up rubbing against the ground, doing nothing for a little while until eventually it catches and starts to move. So I sort of have a weird clutch system going on, but it works, and it actually makes the engine not be overloaded until the wheel ends up finally catching, and at that point the engine's had a long enough time to adjust to the force that it actually ends up working pretty well. And what I also wanted to do is change out the back car so that it has a flat road bed so I can drive some actual cars on it. And the last main thing I want to do is figure out a way to reverse the direction of the engine so that once it gets to the other side, I'll be able to come back and deliver some more cars over. So here what I did is put in a hydraulic, and that actually just directly reversed the direction of the engine initially. I want some way to be able to do it later, and for that I put in 2 hydraulics with an angle between them, so these provide no pulling force against that center node until I tell them to. Once they do that, for whatever reason, pulling on these nodes reverses the direction of the engine, and this allows me to move the other way. And here I actually have that demo going. You can see the engine's moving in the other direction now, and in the background here you can see that the train's moving in the other direction. So now that I had that working, all I had left to do is finish up the level, and I did that off screen, and I'm showing it to you now. So starting out here, you can see I have 3 trucks. I have a monster truck get on, then I have a dump truck get on, and then finally I have the semi truck get on. Once they do that, I have the engine engage and start to move. Goes over to the other side, and it's actually interesting. The monster truck gets caught on the platform, which stops the whole vehicle, and this is a good thing, because it makes the engine be fully stopped, because if it didn't fully stop, it doesn't really like to reverse the direction as well. So the 3 cars deload, they get over to their flags, and now I have 2 more vehicles get on, and I have this little elevator to bring them through. So I have this big bus, and I also have this little Vespa as well. Once they do that, I have the engine re-engage, but this time it's spinning the opposite direction, so it goes backwards. And after quite a bit of time, because it actually does take a little bit longer to go backwards than forwards, I'm really not sure why that's the case. It might just be that the wheel in the back doesn't really grab the ground as well. I'm not sure. But you can see the bus reached its flag, and then finally the Vespa here, and that's the full level. So here I'm just gonna show everything once again in a bit of a prettier way while I go over my final thoughts and the outro. So guys, thanks for watching. I've heard these infinite energy things can be very glitchy, which, I mean, it definitely was. But I'm glad it didn't, like, explode on me constantly like I've seen it do before. And also, I'm glad it had a lot of power. Normally, these things have no power at all, and I think I just had a really good design going here. I was honestly surprised earlier in the video when it was producing a really good amount of force, and I'm just glad I ended up making something here that I'm actually really happy with. So if you have any other ideas for vehicles I can make, let me know down in the comments. In a few weeks or so, I'm going to be doing a video where I go over some of your levels that you guys made. So if you want to make me some hard ones, make sure you put my name in the title. I'll play a few of them for a video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. And otherwise, until next time.